The following program is presented by the Metropolitan Library Service Agency.
Hello, welcome to All About Kids, a program focusing on the interests of children and young people and some of the issues affecting them. An issue commonly discussed among parents, children's librarians, and educators is whether or not to use folktales and fairy tales with young children. Our guests today, Terry Haugen-Sjostrom of Hennepin County Family Court Services, and Judith Savage, who has studied the theories of psychologist Carl Jung in Switzerland and is also a social worker, are here to discuss the impact of fairy tales on children, how fairy tales help kids develop their imagination and their problem-solving skills.
Hello. Today we're going to be talking with Judy Savage about children and fairy tales. Welcome, Judy.
Welcome. Thanks.
Yeah. What I'd like to start out with is hearing you describe a little bit about what happens when a child enters into a fairy tale, reads a good story or book. What happens in that interchange?
Okay. Well, the relationship between the reader and the book is basically structured by the psychological mechanisms of projection and identification. Those are kind of big words. Mm-hmm. But basically what I mean is that the reader projects themselves into the book and identifies with the protagonist or characters in the book. Mm-hmm. We do this as adults, and certainly the child does it. The difference for the child is that the identification is much stronger. Mm-hmm. The child doesn't have the psychological wherewithal to really distinguish subject from object. He and that book and the character in the book are one and the same. So he's in that book in a very immediate way.
He believes that.
He believes it, yeah.
How about an example? Could you help us with that?
Okay. Let's look at a very popular fad, if you will, among preschoolers, and that's with dinosaurs. We, as parents, all know what that's like. Children like to wear the dinosaur t-shirts, and they really become identified with that dinosaur. They get the attributes of the dinosaur.
The strength, the
power.
The
strength, the power, the ferociousness. And what I think is an interesting observation about the dinosaur phenomena with preschoolers is to ask the question, why the attraction? What's in it for the child? When we were kids, we had superheroes. They were certainly bigger than life, and yet they were human, Superman, Superwoman. This generation of children is into dinosaurs. Now that's altogether bigger, isn't it? I mean,
Very
that's quite
much
a force. It seems to me that we could probably make some assumptions that today's child feels keenly the complexity of the world and feels a kind of helplessness that perhaps you and I didn't have to feel because the world wasn't quite so complex.
Or dangerous.
Or dangerous,
yeah.
That's right. Yeah. So they're empowered by these great ferocious beasts who have to be dealt with. And no parent can neglect a Tyrannosaurus Rex,
no.
can they? I mean,
ignore, no.
So I think that's kind of how that illustrates what happens in the projection, where the child takes a part of himself and attributes it to the dinosaur, identifies with it, and what happens to the dinosaur happens to the reader.
And is that same kind of dynamic occurring in a fairy tale then also?
Yes, that's the basic relationship between the reader. In fact, what fairy tales have to offer, I think, over and above modern contemporary children's literature, is that more than contemporary literature, they really get at this symbolic identification process. The symbols of fairy tales are not simply little Billy Smith who lives on block A. Instead, they're much more archetypal, if you will, or universal. The prince, the king, the queen, the hero, the princess in distress. It speaks more than to the particular individual child that we see as the protagonist in most contemporary children's literature. What that evokes for the reader is the possibility to engage in a much more meaningful way with the characters of a fairy tale. It gives the room, literally, the breadth for the reader to project all kinds of things into it. But when the protagonist is Billy Sue,
Right.
the scope can only be
Narrow.
narrow.
And this is broader. The
This
child
is
can
broader.
walk in with his or her own reality.
That's right.
And find a place for themselves
That's
in the
right.
fairy tale.
Exactly, and of course the child either most likely identifies with the protagonist,
The hero.
the hero or the
heroine.
heroine, and that's its intent. That it's sort of the protagonist is like the ego. Okay, but the child identifies with every character in every part of the story
At the same time.
at the same time. Yeah, it's a very fluid identification. The other characters are kind of part objects. I mean, they represent, for example, in The Evil Witch, the badness, and only the badness. But the child will have some sympathy for that, as sometimes when you read a story, for example, to a child where the bad witch gets killed, they will spontaneously discuss their pity and sorrow for it's too bad, you know, that she had to come to that end. So that you can see there, even though she's altogether bad, they're identified with her. Because they're bad too.
That's right. That's
They
right.
know.
So they're beginning
Yeah.
some awareness
That's right.
of their duality, their goodness and their badness.
And that's, of course, the power of fairy tale. That it acts that out. It gives us an opportunity to see the goodness and the badness that is really within, but now is put out externally so it can be known.
Can you speak about some examples of common fairy tales and just describe the themes that might be in them that children might identify with?
Sure. Well, we can, in our work that we've done over the years, working with divorce situations and family crises for children, the themes of abandonment are very relevant there. Hansel and Gretel, taken into the forest, abandoned by a cruel step-parent and an inadequate real parent, father. And in having then to make their way in the world without a real sense of a nurturing, protective parent behind them. We see all too often just that kind of thing enacted in the public life. And in cases where courts and other community services have to get involved. So the theme of abandonment is one. Struggling with evil is another, certainly.
For instance, the witch and Hansel and Gretel,
sure.
and how they overcome her.
Right. Another theme would be the redemption of the old, the dying system, the king as he personifies, the old king as he personifies this no longer viable governmental body, if you will. And he then is going to be replaced and redeemed by the prince, who then enacts a quest. And in the quest is able to regenerate and reanimate the community. We hope sometimes that this would happen in presidential elections. Unfortunately, I don't know how successful that really is, but that's the same kind of possibility, the hope is there.
So these universal themes, you call them archetypes, are present in fairy tales and help all of us, adults and children, find our place in them, and actually, for some children, do some unconscious problem solving.
That's right.
Face some dilemmas that might be theirs in their day-to-day life and kind of wrestle with that.
That's right.
So in that wrestling, they probably understand some of their fears and anxieties, but then also they must have strength and success in that too, just like the hero does.
That's right.
And they walk away with good feelings. How wonderful.
Yeah.
Okay.
There's usually a redemptive end. You know, the
Or the
hero,
moral.
the moral, and it usually comes out well. Little Red Riding Hood is brought out of the wolf's stomach, you know, and this is one of the values, of course, that it is a task that has been accomplished that builds self-esteem. I liked your comment, unconscious problem solving. And if I may, I would like to just digress a bit on that. You and I have both, in working with children, had to use literature as a way to help children cope with the problems that they face. And these kinds of books, the books that give very rationalistic explanations of children's life situations, such as the Boys and Girls book about divorce, or books that might deal with adjustment of a new baby into a family. All of these kinds of things have a place and are important because they help a child identify some of his or her experiences. But the wisdom of your remark, unconscious problem solving, I think goes to the more important issue of the over-dependence that we have placed upon rationality as a way of helping children cope. Bear in mind that children, especially, you know, are not already rational beings. Their whole evolution is working towards that end, but it hasn't happened yet.
So they're primarily
Irrational.
forces of irrationality and
That's
fantasy.
Right. That's right.
Okay.
Imagination. And their rational skills are not yet fully developed. When we approach their problems with a rational focus, in a very indirect way, we undermine their sense of competence.
We're imposing on them our mode of thinking.
That's right.
Not acknowledging theirs.
And by virtue of the fact that as a capable adult, you explain...
There are no ghosts.
Yeah, there are no ghosts.
There's no such thing.
Or when you experience this problem, what you have to do is think about this and think about this and anticipate that. When that happens, then you seem very wise. And of course, since the child doesn't already possess that capability, it cannot help but feel somewhat inadequate. It knows it's not there. The fairy tale, in contrast, goes just as you've said, to the unconscious problem-solving, imaginative capability that does exist within the child and builds his or her self-esteem through that.
Oh, how nice.
Yeah.
What fun.
Yeah. And it strengthens their self-esteem in a way that this rational hubris doesn't.
Does not.
Yeah.
Well, what then would you say to parents or others who are concerned about themes of violence in fairy tales or frightening their children?
Yes. That comes up often when I discuss this topic in public forum. And children will be frightened. My answer to that is has several points. First of all, I think that it takes some sensitivity on the part of the parent to find us age-appropriate fairy tale. The children will let us know by their reaction. One of the ways they'll let us know is they may not even be interested in it, which means that probably the things that are being discussed in the fairy tale are not of that child's particular development. But if they're very frightened by the witch and so on, perhaps it's a bit too much. There it's not so much a question, though, of just never letting them read that, but perhaps bringing it back at a later time. There's really no fairy tale, however, that is going to do irreparable damage to a child's psyche. The skill that is needed on the part of the parent is to be the container for the fears.
A container for the fears.
Again, not an overweening dependence on rationality. Oh, there's no such thing as this. But rather a capacity to withstand the fear and hold the fear and not seem shaken by it. And understand.
Capacity
right, that's right.
To contain the fear for the
right,
child.
Right. And understand it, empathize with it, but yet not be themselves intimidated by it. The child then can see that in that the way the parent behaves, that they will not always feel helpless. And by providing the child an opportunity to talk about those fears, usually there's a way you can work the story around and the discussion around so that the child comes to a self-competent place. For example, well, Billy, what would you do about that witch? And help him find ways that he could contain that witch and put her in the place, which is, of course, what happens in the story.
Okay. And containing meaning overpower, evade,
find
outsmart,
a place for it, yeah.
Whatever.
Right. So that then you're really bringing home the identification of Billy with Hansel in the story. And Hansel did come out victoriously.
With the help of his sister.
With Gretel, you bet. That's one of the ways I use fairy tales in my analytical work with adult patients as amplifications of personal issues. And Hansel and Gretel are wonderful illustrations of the need for male and female partners, whether marital pairs or brothers, sisters, or whatever, co-workers, to work collaboratively towards an end. Out of mutual respect and patience as a virtue.
What fun.
Yeah.
Okay. That's very interesting. Could you say something then about the violence in fairy tales, not in terms of how a parent speaks to a child about that, but how that compares and contrasts with the violence in our culture?
Yeah.
Worse, better, the same?
Yeah. Again, I think it resides in the symbol, in the importance of the symbol. As I experience the culture in the cultural violence, what we see is a literal violence, people literally getting killed. All right, look at the violence in fairy tales. Little Red Riding Hood, who we've already spoken about, is ingested into the wolf and is taken out of the wolf's belly by the huntsman. Yes, this is violent. However, there is always a transformation. So that the violence in most fairy tales has a transformative component. It's a means through which something changes, and there it suggests, I think, and puts the child in touch with the ever important regenerative underlying principle of life, that just as the seasons, we have a death and a decay and then a rebirth. And this is where fairy tales have this very important spiritual dimension. The way it evokes the rebirth imagery.
The continuity of life.
The continuity of life, you bet. Yeah.
What fun.
Yeah.
Okay. Are there other themes about fairy tales that you'd like to share with us? Things that you think we as parents or readers ourselves of fairy tales might be interested in?
We can talk a little bit about the Dumpling.
Okay.
He's an interesting character. There's always...
That's an unfamiliar word to me, Dumpling.
Oh, Dumpling, okay. He's the sort of poor soul in the family that's not very bright, not very skilled, the youngest brother usually of 3, and very popular. Dumpling motifs are very popular among children because it gives them the opportunity to identify with that in themselves that is not yet well developed. They have the capacity to illustrate for the child that it is sometimes the things that are felt as inferior that are really the potentially strong suit in the child's personality. If you know the Dumpling themes, it'll always be there are 2 other brothers and they go off on a quest and
they're successful.
They're not successful.
Oh, they're not.
They're not successful. They go off, it seems they're entitled to go, and because they're better than him. And the Dumpling's usually sort of abused by everyone. And they don't see his potential. And then so the brothers go off, and they are not successful, and then eventually it falls to the Dumpling to do the redemption. And he does.
The day.
He saves the day.
Okay.
And so the child then really identifies with his, the struggle he has to he's not yet perfect. And yet he can save the day. Yeah.
I'm taken, as I listen to you talk, about the kind of inner work that a child could do as they learn and listen and grow into fairy tales. That sounds so much, I would think, of an adult, so much like an adult job. And here we're talking about children.
Yes.
Learning about themselves, their strengths and their weaknesses, and solving problems through books and fairy tales, and learning how to cope.
That's right. That's right. And I would like to see any conscientious parent who's choosing the child's literature to attempt to pick some of the modern day stories, because they relate to modern day issues the child needs to cope with, but to also include fairy tales and myths and things that are really the products of hundreds of years of evolution through the oral tradition passed down, where the irrelevant parts fade away and what stays is the essence of the human experience. So the child literally places himself into the struggles that all humankind has dealt with in the past, and tries to deal with them himself.
And those are the universal themes.
Those are the
you were
universal
talking about
themes, nothing
before.
more complex than that. Yeah.
What an exciting journey for a child and a parent to share.
Yeah, it's fun. Yeah.
That's fun. So you would recommend fairy tales for children?
Yes, highly.
And their parents.
And I would object absolutely to certain attempts on the part of authors to sort of sterilize the fairy tale.
Clean them up?
Clean them up. Take out the violence, take out the distasteful parts. I find that hubris. I find that just terribly arrogant. And really destroying the essence of the myth. Yeah.
Well, I appreciate your conversation with us today. I'm feeling like I want to go home and reread myself some fairy tales and understand them perhaps in a different way. Understand them for what they are in terms of road signs on a journey.
That's right.
Yeah.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
Yeah. Thank you, Judy.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goldilocks and the Three Bears, as retold by James Marshall. One would think there's not a lot new that anyone could say about Goldilocks and the Three Bears, but James Marshall has managed to create a modernized version of this old favorite in his typical humorous fashion. While retelling the story of the naughty little girl, Marshall keeps to the basics of the tale, but adds comic interest with his version of the dialogue, such as this passage in the very beginning. Once there was a little girl called Goldilocks. "What a sweet child," said someone new in town. "That's what you think," said a neighbor. The illustrations are almost cartoon-like. I particularly liked Baby Bear's messy room. The large, colorful pictures make this a good addition for storytime collections or lap reading. It was chosen as a Caldecott Honor Book for 1989. School Library Journal gave it a starred review. Hornbook thought it was not as good as Marshall's Little Red Riding Hood. I would agree with the book jacket, which states, "Some picture books are much too hard, some are much too soft, but James Marshall's Goldilocks and the Three Bears is just right. Kids from 3 to 9 should love it."
An unusual version of Goldilocks and the Three Bears, charmingly illustrated by James Marshall, reviewed by Lois Andersen, Children's Services Librarian at the Oxboro Community Library in Bloomington. Thanks for joining us on All About Kids. Please tune in again.
This has been a presentation of Hennepin County Library in conjunction with the Twin Cities Metropolitan Library Service Agency. We thank you for watching, and we hope you visit your public library often.